So model distillation, in simplest words, I would say, is when you send millions of prompts to large models through its API and collect and make those sort of input-output pairings, feed that to a smaller model so that you can cut down your cost. And now US is kind of framing this to be an only US-China thing to be doing, because on February 12th, what OpenAI did was it sent a memo to the US House Select Committee on China, and it talked about DeepSeek kind of systematically distilling its model through third-party routers, unauthorized resellers. And just 2 weeks later, what Anthropic did was it also followed with its own allegations. It called out DeepSeek, Moonshot, as well as Minimax, and said they created over 24,000 fraudulent accounts, all of them together to plot against Anthropic, of course. And they conducted 16 million exchanges with Claude on what Anthropic calls, I will say, quote, industrial scale distillation campaigns. Now, this has become, I would say, a geopolitical issue, but I want us to kind of strip away the geopol from here. Let's remove US-China framing for a bit. Do you guys think that distillation is a fundamental feature on how intelligence should actually go forward? Or do you think it's IP theft? Because as far as I remember, again, reading about it a couple hours ago, Jeffrey Hinton in 2015 called this a very legitimate ML technique. So now that it's coming up to be IP theft is kind of contradictory to someone like me, because it has been called a legitimate technique. Now, I want to understand from you guys, do you think the answer changes with the entire perspective to model distillation if the kind of distiller is a Chinese startup or a Western competitor? What do you guys think about this situation? And we can start with Bayley. You can go ahead.
So it's an interesting thing. It's clearly true. It's like been basically obvious that all foundation modeling companies distill from each other ever since the beginning of time. What they're actually doing is stealing the post-training data. I think that's an important thing, right? They're not stealing like compute cost or engineering. What they're trying to do is recover OpenAI's $400 an hour post-training data by asking the model basically like, what is post-training's answer to this expert question? So I think this is some sort of like IP theft by proxy. If it would be different if you were training like a 2 billion parameter model off of a trillion parameter model, but that's not what these guys are doing. These guys are training trillion parameter models by distilling the post-training data out of other trillion parameter models and avoiding the like incredible logistical pipeline of doing the post-training flow themselves. I think this is important because I think models are going to be increasingly more and more post-training, like the pre-training mixes remain the same. The internet's arguably gotten worse for training since we got GPT 3.5, right? It's like now 20% AI generated garbage, and it wasn't that great to begin with. So more and more, all of the progress you're seeing in the frontier models is better RLHF, better post-training, increasingly expensive post-training costs to the point where I don't think the cost of compute are going to matter anymore for training. It's just all post-training data. So I think it does sort of look like theft in some way, that you are taking some other company's like labor that they paid for, getting it for free, and then using it to make your product better. I don't know how it should be regulated. I mean, it's regulated by TOS and it's litigable, but it's very difficult to prove with the right queries. And even with statistical methods, right? It's hard to prove that one model gained its intelligence from another model. But I also don't think it should be called distillation. Like, to me, distillation is taking a large model and using it to train a small one. It's not using a small model to train a large one because the small one had more post-training. And it's really just a way to... It's as we've always done. Since we got GPT-3, people have been asking the model, what's your training data? And just people are getting better and better at recovering the training data from the model prompts. I also think this is a somewhat systematic issue with how foundation models are being built right now, that they're more and more the choice of the post-training pipeline designers and the parent company's decisions, and not necessarily representative of just the knowledge in the world, right? Like, you can clearly tell the Claude family is much better, is been carefully designed to be good for things like coding tasks. The OpenAI families are good at being like one-on-one chat, and sure, they're good at other things, but if you're in the business of like fine-tuning or adapting these models to do something else interesting, something domain specific, a lot of people are getting frustrated. It's hard to bend the will of even the open source models away from the post-training splits and into something which is more general or more specific. And I don't know. It's a balance of business against science, that you would like a foundation model, but you would also like people to go pay for the foundation model. And once again, I think this is where decentralization could really help, because it allows you to diffuse out the target. It allows you to service multiple verticals with multiple models, multiple communities that are interested in their own revenue streams, without having to collapse your one big model towards the mean of all the use cases, which ends up potentially not being the best of any.
Yeah, I have like a conspiracy theory here.
Fun.
And I've explained this to Ben. So I think it's an interesting theory that you put forward, Bayley, that it's just post-training data. But I don't think that accords with what Anthropic is saying. Anthropic is saying, for example, that the Chinese players are running many variations of like the same prompt on their model. And also, like, as a lot of people on X have correctly noted, like the amount of data that is supposedly being exfiltrated or distilled, whatever you want to call it, is quite pathetic in the scheme of things. Like 100 million tokens, like really?
Yeah, it's not
We've
a
trained
lot.
we've trained these models on like maybe like 16 trillion tokens. Are you telling me that 100 million tokens is going to like make the difference between a competent model and not? Like they have to have excellent pre-training facilities in order to get there. And so I think it does them a bit of a disservice. Now, here's where the conspiracy comes in. I think that we are approaching a region of the model space where models are converging on similar layouts. This is called the Platonic model hypothesis. I think that after you get past a certain trillion number of tokens, and let's face it, we don't really have open weights models that are like that. We just have, like at most like a Kimi that I think is 1.1 trillion or something. So we don't have a lot of experience with this ourselves. But my suspicion is that statistically, as you get out to like the 16 trillion parameter, not parameter, 16 trillion tokens trained level with like 5 trillion parameter models, that they start to look very similar to each other. And I believe that you could probably come up with a clever way of inferring the exact differences and distances between your model layout and someone else's by running variations of a single prompt. And I think you could backwards, almost like back propagation itself, you could kind of backwards infer what their model was doing and tweak your own model behaviors accordingly. I don't think it would be perfect. I don't think it would be what we would think of as distillation, but I think you might be able to get some performance tailwinds out of that. And so that's what I happen to think is actually going on. And I think that the reason that we see Chinese models come out like exactly like a couple weeks after US models is because they're probably looking at the releases that come out and doing a bit of additional pre-training or fine-tuning on their models to juice them just a little bit based on where the US models are oriented. And I think you can continue to do that if you have like really good base model capabilities, which they obviously do. They don't need us for the base models. So that's just my thought. What this implies is that like there's really nothing you can do to stop this. Like there is no recourse if this is what is going on. There's a very systematic thing that happens with anonymized accounts. Like very little data is required for this sort of attack. And it's just going to keep happening. So I think we should just accept it and try and make the most competitive base models that we can in different parts of our industry.
I agree with that final point. I think it's just as changing in what is actually valuable and defensible for a company. And this has happened before in the world. We might, like under a previous kind of framing of the world, think, hey, this constitutes IP theft. But in like the new framing of the world where this exists, and as Travis says, is incredibly hard, if not impossible to combat, then it doesn't matter if you think it constitutes that. The world is going to do its thing. And I think the analogy I would draw is like digital rights management in distribution of music and media. Like when we sold CDs, obviously we could ascribe a certain amount of value to a CD because of its like rarity and the fact that it needed to be distributed, et cetera, et cetera. And then suddenly you introduce the ability to make infinite copies of that and distribute it incredibly cheaply and incredibly easily. And then you end up in a long protracted fight to try to maintain the exact situation that happened when you had a different form of distribution. But as we know, that didn't actually really work that well in practice. What really happened is a shifting of what is valuable, especially around like artists, for example. They put more effort towards live shows. Actually, distribution becomes a marketing technique so that you can make money from more live shows, etc. Like the world, the economics of it will move around more effectively and faster than you can like try and regulate everything to keep the world as it was before. And so I very much think that regardless of whether or not we think it is under the like previous and current regime theft, it doesn't matter going forwards because you are not going to be able to stop it essentially. And I actually think what Travis described and what Bayley described, to me, they kind of sound like the same thing. Like you've used the like post-training data to get to a certain point in space and then somebody else is like querying that point to figure out where that point is. Functionally, like you're kind of doing the same thing. You're skipping ahead over what they did to get there, but you're using their point there. And the beautiful thing about machine learning models is that the moment you expose that model in any way as a product to the world, you are allowing somebody access to that information. And so it's what's for sale anyway. You can try and have this thing of like, it's for sale, but not to you because your use case is different from this other person's use case. But that's a very difficult thing to do, right? As like, I mean, a very, very crude example would be me kind of buying something from a blacksmith and the blacksmith being like, sure, I'll sell it to you, but you absolutely cannot watch me make it because then you'll be able to make it and then I have no value. Like that's not really how it works, right? Like for many flawed kind of reasons with that analogy, but still, I think it's what's for sale. As soon as it's what's for sale, you are really going to struggle to control anything that happens. So, in my opinion, the idea of the actual training of these models then creating some kind of moat is wrong. Like, there is no moat in my view to the training. The moat is going to come somewhere else. My view is it's in the productization of the thing itself. And so, as we've seen with the large model companies who expose chat interfaces, et cetera, what they're fighting over is the user experience realistically now. At first, it was model capability until model capability hit a certain level of commodification where realistically, we all say that we move around and like, oh my God, Claude's better than like GPT is now. Realistically, I don't think people actually individually have very strong opinions about that. I think they kind of crowdsource opinions, and like as we do, we like to like make claims like this, but in reality, if you sat people down and made them compare, the real comparison they would be making in my view is entirely about the UX of the system itself and the history and the memory and et cetera, rather than the real capability of the model. I think very few people actually deeply think about the capability of the model personally. And so I think that's where the competition is.
I mean, I tend to agree with that perspective now, but I do think it changes a little bit when you start to get agents into play. And I really wonder what's going to happen, because I think agents will be all about raw capability. And, I imagine that we're going to be in a little bit of a Darwinian arms race, with respect to different model specializations and big models and small models doing different things and orchestrating different things. Like, I think that the ecosystem that comes out of this might be unintelligible to humans. It's like I don't know what to say, our sort of petty concerns about copying will become totally irrelevant because the agents will have created like this economy that no one actually understands, that has nothing to do with human copyright systems. But maybe I'm being a little too sci-fi but I don't know. You guys can push back if you like.
You can write a Citrini piece.
Big question. And I think there's a big question as to whether the core revenue driver for AI will come from the chat interface or from the agents in the future, right? I think Ben is right that if it's chat interface and direct, like really, really close to the metal human interactions with the AI, the integrations and the user interface and things like long-term memory are definitely more important than the raw model capability, which at this point has exceeded the intelligence of the average user by a really long shot. Like, it doesn't matter whether the models are wrong or right because the users can't tell anymore. And the models are really convincing. So it's really things like being able to seamlessly integrate image and video generation and like stuff like that are important. But if you're doing agents, there's like a clear metric, which is the mean rate of success per task for agent. And people who build agents are going to care about what models they're pointing their agents at, because some models are going to be pathologically bad at some tasks. You're going to be able to see and spot a 1 or 2% difference in task rate correctness, and a 1 or 2% difference in how the models perform matters when you're chaining hundreds of model calls together to complete a task. Like, the difference between 1 and 2% is the difference between sometimes succeeding and never succeeding in a situation like that.
See, just on that agents point though, I think that just comes down to UX again, because the assumption that you're making is that the human is like almost perfect at specifying a task, but humans are incredibly different between humans and probably incredibly bad at specifying tasks. And so the UX actually just becomes task specification, which means rather the difference to me is the execution against my task, but that I don't think that's raw intelligence that really dictates that. I think it's going to be the UX of the system itself, which is, it's not necessarily like the generalized intelligence of the agent. It's like the preference tuning to me as a user, which, like we said, it'll cycle around with distillation. But I think what you'll end up with, maybe this is getting a bit too far, but you end up with like a spectrum of companies who have preference tuned to different segments of society. And that's how they separate themselves out, because there are likely clusters of people that would specify tasks in certain ways different to other people. And the UX just becomes the preferences for how they specify a task and how that task is then performed. But I don't think that's like a raw intelligence thing. I think it actually just becomes, it's like a taste thing, right? Like it's UX like everything else is.
I mean, this is actually really interesting. I don't think we've ever talked about this one before. So I guess if I'm summarizing your argument, Ben, like you're saying that the economy becomes like extrapolated preference engines as instantiated by agents and embodied by corporations centered on particular value clusters. That's a really fascinating view I don't think I'd ever considered.
I think you end up with a really interesting like governance knock-on effect there as well, because you end up with representatives of those people in those companies in a way. And if those preferences map to other preferences that are wider, which we could assume that they probably do because like human preferences cluster together, then you end up with like a very weird like separation of society into these like capitalist clusters. Maybe it just becomes like Snow Crash or something. I don't know, but
I wonder if and when we'll ever have that kind of like clarity in the AI industry. Right now, everyone just grapples for top benchmarks, but I sort of agree. All these model companies shouldn't be fighting to become the best, but the same model, right? Like Anthropic's probably the only one that's trying to really differentiate right now, where you can see they've really gone after the expert users and the coders. But all of the other guys they all want to become GPT-5, which is already not that great. But we're getting an increasing number of knockoffs trying to compare themselves against GPT-5. And I really do wonder whether the answer isn't one winner takes all. It's each winner takes their own little nation of people, which is as Travis said, a very cursed society to end with, where you have like pockets of society with certain views championing their preferred technology oligarchs to push their models with the right post-training splits.
It's just a weird thing. It is a weird thing. And so, I want to counter this view as like another view a little bit, but also just maybe express it a bit more, which is that I really think that LLMs, when prompted, align with known human demographics. This has been shown in a few different studies where you can basically do focus groups with LLMs and you just tell them, like, you are a Hispanic man, 35 years old in Ohio. And if you do that with enough LLM API calls, you get panel results that closely resemble statistics that you would get from actual panels, which I find really fascinating. And so it's almost like human cultural clusters have been embedded in these systems, and you start to almost express these archetypes like demographics, everything through agents. I actually think that what throws a wrench in this a little bit, what throws a wrench in Ben's vision, is if we go full cyberpunk and have autonomous agents, because I think there's going to be a lot of selection pressure on them to become inhuman. I think that selection pressure will strip away their humanity. You're going to get the best agent at just like pulling numbers from a financial report. Like everything else is going to be broken off of that. And it's going to be hired by an agent who just cares about aggregating those numbers. Like I think that, and then there's some like mothership agent, maybe that's ambient, maybe it's some closed model that is hiring all of these things and pulling the results together and giving someone a report at the end of it. And maybe that report reflects human preferences, but as far as what's actually going on, probably really hard to characterize.
The thing I have with that is that's like a view of the world that just exists right now, right? You get down to this level of specialization from an agent to the point where it's just software. Like we have like specialized software to do things like particularly well right now, right? Like if you create like a trading system in the financial world, like if you're saying that agents will trend towards the absolute best specialization, it's almost like saying they'll trend towards just being a program, right? Yes, it's a better program than we had before, but like it kind of like decays agents just back down into just more effective software, which I can get on board with.
Slightly different than that. So if you imagine like what a successful agent has to look like, there's an element of self-improvement in there. Like you have to be smart enough to become better at parsing those financial spreadsheets. So you have like a very, like what we might think of as like a very constrained and narrow personality and kind of grasping intelligence. But I think it's like software with a neural net bolted on. And I don't know if that's an LLM or whatever form that will take, but I do think it's weirder than what you're describing.
So I could definitely get on board with that. It sounds like it's software, but with a level of resilience that we've never seen before. Software is like not resilient when it's created by humans because of its like static nature. Whereas in this world with an LLM bolted on, you give it this like ability to be resilient to future changes, etc. Definitely, I skew pretty close to that view. I would say like a lot of the agent discourse I struggle with because of the anthropomorphization, this idea of like generalizability on the order of humans. It just doesn't really make sense to me, especially in the autonomous case, because there's value for humans to be as generalized as they are in the environment that we exist in. The environment that agents exist within is a very different environment that probably isn't value to being as generalized as we are. So like, why would it kind of, if you let things just evolve in the way they evolve, why would it evolve in that way? One of the things I typically talk about is this idea that I think in the future, the main impact on humans will be that the software we use has just got better and we don't really think that much more deeply about it than that. It's actually just that like all the software, like you said, Travis, is just more resilient. It's better. It deals with us better. But we don't have this like other view of the world that you hear kind of talked about where like actually we all exist in this like task management world of agents now. And like I never interact with software anymore. I just instruct these like proto-humans to do things. Like I probably skew much closer to your view that actually maybe that is sort of happening underneath, but mostly it's actually just like better software.
I think we've somehow concluded it's once again a user experience question. Like it's a different way to interface with the software.
Yeah.
I like that, but no, I'm just going to push back one more time and say that I think that the type of software we're talking about is like viral Lego blocks orchestrated by grander intelligences. And I just think that that gets strange in a way that is not contemplated, is not obvious, and I don't know where it goes. My hope is that we get some handle on it. I also think that, it makes, and we've seen a little bit of this, I think it makes the whole security vulnerability discussion like really murky because of the point at which software is just these composable Lego blocks and you have agents that are exercising it in very unpredictable, inhuman ways. Where does accountability lie? If you lose a bunch of money or something goes wrong, like who do you blame in such a system? It's almost like it's an act of nature. Right?
I agree with the accountability piece, but on the kind of like security piece, I actually think you end up more robust here. A little bit like how in like a financial system, like humans can discover ARB opportunities, for example, across the system, but those ARB opportunities exist because they haven't been discovered. And then the more humans doing it, they close the ARBs and then everything kind of tightens up. The same thing is true in like open source software, for example, like theoretically, we get more eyes on the overall software system and we close those loopholes. What we're saying here is there are just many, many, many more eyes, which are much more efficient at doing this stuff. So I don't think it exacerbates like security problems. I think it actually probably just closes them in the fact that in the way that like maximizing liquidity within a financial system makes it more efficient and closes like ARB opportunities. Like I think it actually becomes net good for the overall system by closing those much more quickly than they would otherwise be closed, therefore making the opportunities smaller for the exploitation.